From the birth of the United States to today, the right to vote has been a powerful, hard-won privilege. Over centuries, countless groups have fought to secure this right, each milestone paving the way for greater inclusion. Let's journey through this timeline of determination and change. Our story begins in the 1760s and 1770s, when American colonists were growing increasingly frustrated with British rule. They famously demanded no taxation without representation, resisting British-imposed taxes without a voice in Parliament. This unrest eventually led to the Revolutionary War, setting the stage for America's fight for democratic rights. The United States Constitution was drafted in 1787. However, it allowed states to decide who could vote, generally limiting that right to white landowning men. This left out many others, including the poor, women, and people of color. Fast forward to the 1820s, when the fight for voting rights gained traction again. Working-class white men without property argued that they, too, deserved a say in the country's future. By the 1850s, property requirements for voting were largely eliminated, broadening the voter base to include all white men. Following the Civil War, the question of voting rights for newly freed Black Americans emerged. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, was a monumental step, stating that voting rights could not be denied based on race. However, obstacles like literacy tests and poll taxes persisted, restricting access for Black men in practice. While Black American men were technically granted the right to vote, women of all backgrounds were still excluded. The women's suffrage movement took off in 1848, with activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony leading the charge. After decades of protests, arrests, and sacrifice, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920, finally granting women the right to vote. Native Americans, despite being the continent's original inhabitants, were not considered citizens and couldn't vote. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act granted them citizenship, but some states continued to block their voting rights. It wasn't until the 1960s that voting rights for Native Americans were fully recognized. Asians who had immigrated to the United States faced severe discrimination, including the inability to become citizens or vote. In 1943, the Magnuson Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, allowing Chinese immigrants to gain citizenship and vote. Later, other Asian groups achieved the same rights. The civil rights movement of the 1960s focused intensely on voting rights. Despite the 15th Amendment, many states used discriminatory practices to prevent Black Americans from voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark achievement, outlawing these barriers and enforcing protections for marginalized voters. During the Vietnam War, young Americans argued that if they were old enough to be drafted at 18, they should also be allowed to vote. The 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18 and ensuring young Americans could have a say in their government. Since the 1980s, activists have worked to make voting more accessible to people with disabilities, non-English speakers, and others who face logistical challenges when seeking to cast their vote. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 helped ensure accessible polling places, and updates to the Voting Rights Act offered protections for non-English speaking voters. We mustn't take this privilege for granted by not voting. For if we do, we risk allowing marginalizing ideologies to play out in the electoral process, of which we have always stood against. The right to vote is more than a privilege, it's a testament to centuries of resilience, struggle, and enduring hope. Each milestone is a reminder of the power of collective action toward a just society. So cast your vote on Election Day, in honor of those who came before us who sacrificed their lives for this freedom, for those who are looking for a beacon of light today, and for those who will come after us. They all will be glad we did our part to exercise the hard-fought individual power of the vote, contained within fair and open elections.